The anime of Akame ga Kill is one of the more memorable animes that I've seen, probably due to its anime ending. I've heard that the manga ending was better, but I've not seen it yet. But regardless of that, just thinking of the ending makes me wonder how things would go if the legendary swordsman from the world of One Piece, Roronoa Zoro, had been reincarnated as Tatsumi, with both his experiences and skill transferring over. Would things play out differently? Well, today that's what I'm trying to figure out. It's your host, Sage D Samurai here, bringing you the What If movie to what if Tatsumi had been Zoro's reincarnation. Thank y'all so much for tuning into this What If, and thank you to the person who commented down below in the comment section and recommended this video. I saw your comment, so here's the What If. Hopefully you do enjoy. And now with that being said, y'all, it's time for us to begin this What If. So with that being said, let's get started.
You're never gonna make it, you're not good enough. There's a million other people with the same stuff. You really think you're different? Man, you must be kidding. Think you're gonna hit it, but you just don't get it. It's impossible, it's not probable, you're irresponsible. Too many obstacles, you gotta stop it, yo. You gotta take it slow, you can't be a pro. Don't waste your time no more. Who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
So to begin the What If, we're not going to start out with Tatsumi's origins. Now dating way back, all to the point where Tatsumi is still living in the village, we see him now living a pretty similar life to that of the main timeline. But you see, all that will soon change by the time that Tatsumi was at the age of 10, as that's when he had been awakened. The legendary swordsman from the world of One Piece, Roronoa Zoro. Now when Zoro is awakened, he would at first be confused by the whole situation, as at first he thought he just simply shrunk back to being a child once again. But soon after finding out about what happened, he'll be kind of concerned about the whole thing, as he'll be trying to offer back the bodies of Tatsumi, but that just simply was not going to happen. Cause the thing is, Zoro and Tatsumi, they're both one and the same, as Tatsumi was the latest reincarnation of Zoro. Now when Zoro soon finds out about this, at first he's quite stumped about the whole situation. But soon over time, after he came to accept the situation, we see Zoro then begin to actually trying to get used to this new body of his. As the one thing he took notice of the fact was the simple fact that Tatsumi was weak. And I'm talking about weak in Zoro's standards. As even as a kid, Zoro was extremely strong, so in his own eyes, Tatsumi was even weaker than his old childhood self. And he immediately wanted to change that, especially since he's still going to go after that same dream, this being the dream of becoming the strongest swordsman in the world. We see Zoro beginning to train Tatsumi's body to the absolute limit. But soon over time, with just simply doing this, by the time he was still in the village, Tatsumi realized that he was going to soon end up reaching a roadblock. And although Zoro, or should I say Tatsumi, liked the village, unfortunately he realized that he wouldn't be able to reach his full potential while being here. So during the dead of night, he would then soon end up leaving the village. Now many of the villagers that knew of Tatsumi will be quite upset about this, as they were very worried for their own, but unfortunately they were not able to search for him, mostly because of the fact that by the time it was morning he was completely gone. Now this made many people upset, especially Tatsumi's old childhood friends, but unfortunately they were not able to do anything. So with that, they will have to continue on without Tatsumi. And as for Tatsumi, throughout his entire time of leaving the village, for the next couple of years that went by, we see him just simply being on the road. As throughout this time, he had been taking on the gig of being a bounty hunter, the same gig that he took in his old life. And he will be doing the same thing really, using it as a way for training while also gaining money. As thanks to this, Tatsumi was able to face off against many powerful people in this world, and also began to slowly get more and more adjusted to his new body, causing him to be able to use his old skills and old techniques that he had in his old life. As that was the one thing that Zoro had realized when he actually got reincarnated. But another thing he also realized was the fact that over the time of all this training, he eventually began to regain his old control over his haki. Not as good as he once had it, but good enough to a point where he's actually able to use it on command. As when Zoro had been reincarnated, he would actually try using haki, but the thing is, when he did, he would only be able to hold it for like a few seconds before the control would just simply slip out of his grasp. As this will be due to the fact that Zoro is now in a new body and he doesn't have enough experience with it. But now, thanks to him having so many fighting experience, thanks to him being a bounty hunter, and also thanks to him slaying a bunch of monsters, Zoro had gotten good enough control over his haki to a point where he's at least able to use it in a fight now. And not only that, but he's actually able to use his old sword skills. As now that I caught you guys up with everything that happened with Tatsumi, this is where we now cut back to the present. As we now turn to Tatsumi, we see him currently right now laying down on a carriage, trying to catch up on some sleep. As right now he was heading over to the capital in order to find a place to stay, only for one day. But during the time of him doing so, this is when suddenly the carriage was pulled to a stop, as a monster had bursted out of the ground right in front of the carriage, as the people driving it would scream in terror. Now this would cause Tatsumi to sigh, as he would then exit out the carriage, telling them to calm down. As when he takes a good look at the creature, he just simply sighs before suddenly, in one swift motion, a motion so fast that none of the people who are currently right now driving it could even see, but Tatsumi in that split moment had actually taken out his katana, and with one flick of his wrist, he actually cut the entire creature in half. as the next moment they would then see the creature on top of them, and the next moment they would then see the creature cut in half and split down the middle, as they would then see him then fall on both sides of the road, giving them a free passageway. As they look on in complete shock about what Tatsumi had just done, they then turn to him in sheer amazement that Tatsumi would just simply put the katana back before looking at them with a sigh and going back into the carriage to catch some rest, as he tells them to hurry up since he doesn't want to get there by nightfall, with the people in the carriage agreeing to do so, thanking Tatsumi once again for saving them, as after a brief journey they would then end up arriving at the capital. As we would see Tatsumi thank them before heading off to the capital, we will see him do a little bit of sightseeing here and there before arriving at the location that he wants to be at, this being the bar. Now you see, this wasn't Tatsumi's first time being at the capital, as he usually stopped by in order to get a place to sleep, that or to catch up on any recent information of any enemies that he could hunt down for a profit. As when Tatsumi ends up entering the bar, this is when he actually ends up catching the attention of the owner, who smiles at seeing Tatsumi, telling him that it's been a while. Now Tatsumi would nod his head in response before demanding the usual, as the man would then sigh, as he would then end up tossing Tatsumi a bottle of booze. As we will see Tatsumi for the next few moments just simply sip on some booze while also looking through the latest bounty posters that were currently out right now, as the ones that have been catching his attention the most have been the ones of Night Raid, a vicious group that has been trying to overthrow the capital. As Tatsumi was interested in maybe actually hunting them down, mostly because of the fact that he thinks that they will give him a good fight, but also because of their bounty, as he could use it to get another place to stay, maybe even get a new sword, or just to simply buy booze. But as he was thinking of this though, this was when he would then be approached by a blonde haired woman, this being Leone, as she begins to try to coyly kind of wrap Tatsumi around her finger and pretty much try to rob him blind. But unfortunately that fails horribly, since Tatsumi was not someone who is very easily able to get drunk, as even though she challenged him to a drinking competition, Tatsumi ended up walking out of there with her being the one to pay for the entire tab, as he was feeling quite satisfied about the whole thing. But as Tatsumi was about to walk out of there, as by now it was already nightfall, we would then see him get approached by none other than Arya, a wealthy woman that has been living in the capital, as she looks at Tatsumi with a sad expression, asking him if he has a place to stay. Now immediately, Tatsumi would think that something would be wrong here, but after debating it for quite a while, he then decides to simply go along with it and say that he doesn't, as the lady decides to bring him to her manor so that he can stay the night over there. And Tatsumi, he wasn't really concerned about the danger that was potentially there, as after all, if they were to even try anything, Tatsumi was more than just confident that he can take them down no matter what, as it kind of reminded him of the same situation that happened at Whiskey Peak, when he took down over 100 bounty hunters by himself, mind you. As eventually, after a quick journey, we will then see them end up arriving at the manor, and after a brief discussion with her parents as she introduces Tatsumi to them, we will then see Tatsumi then being allowed to actually rest at the manor, as he will even be given a full course meal so that way he can actually go to bed not hungry. As you'll see Tatsumi once again, as he will just simply be laying down there, making sure to have his swords on standby and everything. This was something he would then wake up at the dead of night, as by this point he already decided it was time for him to leave. But just as he was about to head out though, this is when suddenly he would then stop, as he ends up looking outside only to see Night Raid posted up and everything, as they were all staring down at the manor. Now when Tatsumi sees this, instead of actually being caught off guard by it or shrieking in terror, he just smirks, thinking that this might be more interesting than he thought. As we now do a little bit of a time skip, we see Night Raid, or more precisely Akame, rampaging about the entire manor along with Leone, as both of them were just wreaking havoc across anyone that was working for the family that was there. And so eventually they found Arya, as she was running for her life, trying to get to safety, but unfortunately she was stopped by the both of them. But before things can go too out of control though, this is when suddenly they'll then feel a generous burst of wind blow past them, as they begin to look around wondering what happened, only to see number one that Arya was far away from them, and number two was that someone was right beside her wielding 3 swords, as this will be Tatsumi. Tatsumi will be looking at Akame as well as Leone, as he would then point at Leone before stating that she was the one who couldn't hold her liquor, which caused her to be pissed off, as she would then yell angrily at Tatsumi, telling him that he's gonna pay for what happened earlier, with Tatsumi just chuckling before smirking as he would then look at Akame, or more precisely her blade, as he would actually whistle in appreciation for the sword that she was wielding, commenting how it looks like she was taking care of it. And Akame, hearing this, would nod her head before suddenly giving Tatsumi the opportunity to walk away from this, stating that he has no involvement in the situation right now, and that if he actually valued his life, then he would walk away. And when Tatsumi heard this, he just simply shrugged, saying that he is more than confident that he's going to walk away from this, but that was not the real question here, no. The real question here is if they were the ones who were going to walk away from this, alive at that. Now this would cause the entire area to tense as Akame would then sigh, saying that she did warn him. As this when in one swift movement she would then blitz Tatsumi and she will appear right in front of him with her katana now drawn out. As she would then explain to Tatsumi that she would try to end him the most painless way possible. But this is when, as Akame was actually about to land the blow, this is when in one swift movement, in one quick motion so fast that Akame couldn't even register it until it eventually happened, she would then see that number one, she was flipped onto her back. Number two, her hold over her katana was now completely gone and erased. And number three, she would then see Tatsumi walking away as he then explains to her that she's way too early when it comes to even thinking about killing someone like him. As Akame would end up landing on the ground in complete shock, Leone, who was looking at the scene, would be caught off guard about how Akame was just able to be literally dismantled so easily. As she would then look angrily at Tatsumi before rushing over to him, trying to throw a punch, but Tatsumi seeing this wouldn't smirk, as he just simply ends up dodging out of the way before explaining to her that not only does she suck at holding her liquor, but she sucks at even fighting. As this went in one swift motion, Leone would then be put to the ground as well, as she'd be holding her stomach in pain as she was literally fading in and out of consciousness. Both of them were taken down in one swift movement by one guy, as Arya would be looking at Tatsumi in amazement as she begins praising Tatsumi, thanking him for saving her, but Tatsumi wasn't listening to all of that. He tells her to shut up immediately, which causes the girl to clamor up as this is when the pressure begins to set in. Tatsumi begins to walk past Arya as he then walks his way to the shed, and when he does, without any hesitation, he busts down the door with one sword cut. And when he does, he ends up looking at the very horrific scene. As he sees mountains of dead bodies currently right now laying around the entire shed, he sees a girl currently right now tied up as she had multiple injuries all around as she wasn't even alive by this point. And to make it even worse, he would then see his old childhood friend who was still in the prison looking at Tatsumi in complete shock as he even begins commenting out Tatsumi's name as he begins to mention in a very weak tone that he was very happy to see him again. Now when Tatsumi ends up taking in the scene, he without any hesitation walks over to his friend and in one slash he just completely cuts open the cage that was holding him. As his friend begins to hang on to Tatsumi, cling on to him, he asks Tatsumi where he's been and everything, wondering how exactly things have been going for him. But as much as he wants to know about everything that happened to him, unfortunately, he just simply doesn't have enough time. As he begins to explain about all the horrific deeds Arya and her family did to not only him, but Tatsumi's other childhood friend, the girl, as he explains everything that they did to her and him. As after explaining all this, we would then see him begin to slowly fall in and out of consciousness, as Tatsumi looks at the scene with a dead serious expression. As this is where we now turn to the scene with Arya as we see her trying to escape, but just as she was trying to do so, Leone, who was recovering from her injuries, finally was able to grab her and prevent her from escaping, telling her that she's not going anywhere. As Arya begins to struggle out of her hold, this is when she begins to finally let loose. Her whole facade finally snapped as she begins to scream out in like a complete temper tantrum, explaining why she did it, trying to justify everything she did to all the common people that came to visit the capital. But as she was trying to justify her actions about what she did to the commoners, this is when suddenly a generous gust of wind would then blow past both Akame and Leone, as they end up turning their attention to Tatsumi, who was still looking down at his friends, as he tells Arya that she was too loud and tells her to be quiet. As this is when both Akame and Leone would then turn back to Arya, only to see something surprising, as Arya had been split completely in half, as she would then fall to the ground dead, as they look at the scene with complete shock before looking at Tatsumi with an uncertain gaze, wondering just who was this guy. As Tatsumi ends up looking at his friend, as his friend who had looked at the scene in pure amazement begins to comment once again, stating that Tatsumi was as amazing as he expected him to be. As he begins to slowly fade in and out of consciousness, this is when Tatsumi would then take out his katana, before explaining to him that he's now going to end his suffering. As his friend would look at Tatsumi one last time, he would then send Tatsumi a thankful glance as Tatsumi in one last sword slash will end up killing his old friend, as he made sure to do it in the most painless way possible. As his friend's body would then fall down to the ground limp, this is when Tatsumi would then cut down the ropes that were restraining his other childhood friend, as he then picks up both bodies and prepares to bury them. But as he was heading off to do so, this is when he would then be stopped by Leone, as this is when Tatsumi would then stop as he would then ask Leone in the most serious tone possible, what? As he dared her to even try anything that would stop him from putting his old friends to rest, as after all, if she would try to intervene in this, then he will gladly cut her down. As Leone would step back, of course apologizing for doing this all of a sudden, this one she would then offer Tatsumi a better place to bury them, stating that they shouldn't be buried in the very same location where they had suffered. And Tatsumi, after hearing this, would nod his head, as this when suddenly he would then disappear in one quick motion, as he would appear right next to the other members of Night Raid, catching them off guard. As they were surprised by his speed and just by the way he's able to carry himself, as this is when Tatsumi would then ask them where exactly they're headed to. As this is where we now do a time skip as well as a change of scenes. We see Tatsumi once again, as by this point he had made 2 little gravestones and made sure to bury the bodies of his old friends. As we then see Tatsumi then doing a little bit of a prayer before taking out some booze, as he would then take a sip out of it before dumping the rest of it on top of the graves of his 2 friends, hoping that they rest in peace. As now with that, and after making sure that everything was taken care of, we then see Tatsumi then walk back as we see Leone and Akame waiting for him. As when Tatsumi ends up approaching them, he actually ends up thanking them for bringing him to this place, as he truly wanted to find a good place to bury his old friends, with them telling him that it was alright, as they would then fall into comfortable silence. Until suddenly, Leone would then ask Tatsumi if he wants to join Night Raid, which causes him to nearly fall over. As this is when he would then begin to ask her why exactly he would join Night Raid, as this is when they would begin to explain to him about the whole thing with the corruption that was happening at the capital, and basically why they were doing the things they were doing. And after hearing about all this and understanding the whole situation, this is when Tatsumi then once again asks why exactly would he join them. I mean, don't get him wrong, he understands and feels bad about the whole corruption and everything, but why would he go about doing all this? Now this would cause an argument between both Leone as well as Tatsumi to spring out, but before they can continue on, this is when suddenly Akame would then intervene, as she would then ask Tatsumi if he likes fighting strong opponents, with Tatsumi nodding his head, obviously stating that of course he does. As this is when Akame would then state that he would then face off against the strongest that the capital has to offer, as they're trying to hunt down and take down Night Raid, stating that Tatsumi ends up joining them, that he will get a chance to face off against them. Not only that, but he also gets to frequently train with the rest of them, and each one of them are fairly strong, as this response will cause Tatsumi to release a smirk, as he could already tell that now Akame was speaking his language. But first, Tatsumi felt like he needed to test them, as he needed to make sure that these guys were actually up to his standards, as this is when he would then tell both Akame and Leone that he'll be the judge of that, as he begins walking away, telling them to gather the others, as he was going to be the one to see just exactly how good they were. Now this would cause Leone and Akame to look at Tatsumi as if he was stupid, but they decide to do it regardless, as we now do a time skip as well as a change of scene. As moving forward with the scene, we will then see Tatsumi once again, but this time he will be in an open field with each member of Night Raid surrounding him. He will be casually just standing there with a smirk on his face, as the leader of Night Raid would be there on the side, not participating in the fight since she wasn't combat ready. In fact, she was just here to analyze just how strong Tatsumi really was, as after all, both Leone and Akame had validated stating that if he actually joined Night Raid, he would be a great asset, but she wanted to be the one to judge that. As Tatsumi made sure to look at every last one of them before asking them if this truly is all their fighting members, which causes mine to get pissed as she begins to explain to Tatsumi that he stands no chance. To which Tatsumi would then respond by telling her to be quiet as the adults were talking, causing mine to be pissed off, as this is when she then immediately begins to be the first one to attack Tatsumi. She begins to power up Pumpkin as she would then release a blast directly at Tatsumi, but to the surprise of everyone that was watching, Tatsumi, in one quick instant, after literally releasing one of his swords, he would then cut apart the blast, splitting it in half, as the rest of the blast would then get deflected into separate areas, with none of it hitting Tatsumi. And to make it even more surprising was the fact that his katana that he had just drew was literally not damaged at all. As Tatsumi then looks at mine before telling her and asking her if that was all she got, causing mine to be flustered about the fact that she literally just seemingly embarrassed herself. But as she was in the middle of thinking this is when suddenly Tatsumi would then turn to the rest of them before asking them if they're all going to join in or if they are just going to chicken out, as it will cause every member of Night Raid to tense up, as they would all then rush at Tatsumi one by one. As Tatsumi would then look at the scene with a smirk on his face, as finally things were getting interesting. As this is where we then see the battle between Tatsumi versus Night Raid. Now to start off the fight, we will see Akame then rushing at Tatsumi, as she will then swing multiple slashes at Tatsumi only for him to deflect it all, surprising Akame and many others who were watching on, considering the fact that in their eyes Akame was the strongest one out of them all. As we would see Tatsumi just simply nod his head while also blocking the other slashes that Akame would throw, as he begins analyzing every last one of them before complimenting Akame for her swordsmanship. But unfortunately, he tells her that she still has a long way to go, as he would give her a couple of tips before suddenly sending her flying with one last sword slash, causing Akame to be sent flying back to the group. Now this is when both Leone as well as Sheele would then jump at Tatsumi, as both of them would then send their respective attacks, only to be surprised and as still only with one sword, Tatsumi is able to deflect both of their attacks, commenting that although they definitely have power, unfortunately that simply was not enough. As after saying these words, we will then see Tatsumi then suddenly end up disappearing into a blur, or at least in the eyes of Leone and Sheele, as this is when he will then bombard them with multiple slashes, still only using one sword style, as they will both collapse down to the ground, as they wince in pain from the slashes that they'd gotten. As Tatsumi then looks at the other two, this being Lobuk as well as Bulan, before bringing up a kind of bring it on sign. Now this will cause Bulan to immediately rush over to Tatsumi, as he immediately begins to actually introduce himself midway through the fight. And Tatsumi will be doing the same thing casually as well, while deflecting all the attacks that Bulan can throw at him. As Bulan continued fighting with Tatsumi, even using his spirit to his advantage, unfortunately it just simply wasn't enough. As we will see Tatsumi complimenting Bulan for his skills before suddenly sending him flying, as he will just send a powerful hockey enhanced slash towards Bulan's stomach, causing him to be sent flying and also causing him to be caught off guard. As although he expected Tatsumi to be very strong after seeing what he did to both Leone, Sheele as well as Akame, he wasn't expecting him to be so strong to the point where he's literally able to send him flying with just a simple slash. As this once again made Bulan wonder just where exactly did they find this guy, or more precisely just who is he. As this when suddenly, as Tatsumi was looking at Bulan getting sent flying, this when suddenly he would then be wrapped around in thread as he looks down at the string that was holding him down, as this is when he then looks at Lobuk, telling him that he finally stepped in. Now Lobuk begins to smirk, as this is when Mine would then scream at him to hold him down, as she would then charge up Pumpkin before releasing a blast directly towards Tatsumi, as Tatsumi would then look at the blast with a smirk on his face. Now the blast would seemingly hit Tatsumi, causing a generous amount of smoke to set in the entire area, as one by one every member of Night Raid looks on, wondering if maybe they had done it, while also some of them are worried by the fact that they may have actually killed the guy. But soon those thoughts would then be put to rest, as this is when they would then hear multiple slashes then ring out throughout the entire smoke cloud, as this is when suddenly both Mine and Lobuk would then be sent flying, each one of them having a cut on their cheek, as they would then be slammed into a wall nearby. As this is when we would then see cutting through the smoke will be none other than Tatsumi, as this time instead of having one sword out, he now had two, as he compliments them for the strategy but tells them that they could work on it a little bit more. As this will be the scene that the leader of Night Raid will end up seeing, as she will see her strongest fighters, the one who's been out there, the ones who have been popular for so many years by now, get simply overwhelmed by one man. As she looks on in just pure amazement and in shock, this is when one by one every member of Night Raid slowly gets up, as they all immediately begin to shoot out and attack each one of them at the same time, with Tatsumi just simply deflecting and now using two swords. Now this will go on for quite a while as we see Tatsumi fight off against Night Raid, until eventually it was now by this point the afternoon. As yes, an entire day has went by when this was going down. As we turn to Tatsumi, as we see him currently right now standing in the middle of the field, still remaining unscathed, while every member of Night Raid will be each deeming their own sets of injuries, as some of them had it worse than others, but regardless, every last one of them were pretty injured. Now, as they were doing this though, as Tatsumi begins to compliment them for how long they lasted, this is when suddenly Lobuk would then scream now. As this is when suddenly multiple strings would then burst out of the ground, as they will wrap around Tatsumi, as he will be turned into a ginormous, cocoon full of string. As this is when one by one every member of Night Raid would then launch their respective attacks, mine being the first one, as she would then launch a ginormous blast from Pumpkin, as it would end up hitting the ginormous cocoon. And this is when both Leone and Sheele would then bombard the cocoon with multiple different blows. And while they're doing that, this is when Bulan, who was in the back, would then suddenly end up tossing a spear with full force into the cocoon, as it supposedly ends up hitting the target. And the very last person to finish it off will be Akame, as she would then rushes over, as she would then unsheath her sword before swinging it full force into it, as the entire cocoon would then be chopped in half. As just like that, they had fully believed that they finally ended up besting Tatsumi. But as they were thinking this though, as they look at the scene, this is when suddenly they will then hear the sound of a sword being unsheathed, as they end up immediately turning to behind them, as this is when they would then see that Tatsumi was actually just there looking at the display with an impressed look. As all the members of Night Raid look at him in complete shock, as one by one they would then collapse down to the ground, as this is when Tatsumi would then suddenly get up, as he then approaches them in the middle once again, as he tells them that they all did a good job, and that one day they should all do this again sometime, especially since now he decided to join the group. Now when the group heard this, they didn't even respond or show any cheer or anything. They were actually feeling quite down by the fact they got defeated by one guy who uses 3 swords and didn't even use that 3rd sword. As they all look at Tatsumi and wonder exactly why he even has that sword, if he could just simply end up beating the rest of them with only 2, they decide to put it in the back of their mind for now, as with that we will then see Zoro, or should I say Tatsumi, had joined Night Raid. As now with that, this is where we can now do another time skip. As moving past these events, we end up seeing a couple of things play out. Number one being the fact that Night Raid, unfortunately, thanks to all that fighting that they did with Tatsumi, unfortunately they're going to be out of commission for the rest of the day. So that means every last one of them is going to be resting. Yes, including Akame. In fact, Akame had been the one to take the most injuries when it came to all the members. And it's probably due to the fact that she's the one who kept rushing at Tatsumi trying to win against him, but failed horribly. And the leader did agree to this, although this did cause quite a problem at first, as they had no one to take the missions. And these missions, they don't just stay there for a long time. They have certain windows of opportunities that they must take, and right now was one of them. But luckily, Tatsumi would decide to step in as he decides to take these missions by himself, to which the leader of Night Raid was heavily against it, but unfortunately that was not going to stop Tatsumi, as he even vows to make sure that he returns alive. As with that, for the rest of that day, we will see Tatsumi take on the missions that were supposed to be due that day, as he assassinates all the targets that were supposed to be done. As by the time he was finally finished with all the assassinations, he ends up returning back, as he returns back without any injuries, which was good, as soon as he returned back, all the members who recovered from the earlier activities immediately began to question him and even check him for injuries, to which to their surprise he came back with none. But the real surprising thing was the fact of just how many scars he had all over his body, as that was because of the fact that he was a bounty hunter and that he was literally using it as training, as these were scars that he's gotten from facing off against so many enemies, with some being worse than others. One particular one, but you're all going to find out about that later. As now with that, this will cause the rest of Night Raid to realize that they can put their trust into Tatsumi, as now with that we can now do another time skip. For the next following days that went by, we will see Tatsumi get adjusted to his life in Night Raid, as he will spend most of his time training. Now, this will catch the attention of everyone in Night Raid, mostly because of the fact of just how extreme his training was. It was so extreme that it even made Akame impressed, since he was doing things that even she hadn't even thought about. I mean, seriously dude, he was going ahead and literally doing dumbbell curls and using his feet to do it. Like, this man was literally doing a handstand while doing it. Like, that's not normal. And this would immediately catch everyone else's attention as they begin to see just how far he was willing to train, as he trained until the very night, as that's when he finally stopped. And during that time, he would also take on missions, not at all feeling fatigued from all the training that he had gotten, as this will cause many of them to finally realize exactly why they lost to Tatsumi, as he literally was someone who just worked extremely hard for his strength. And this will cause many members of Night Raid to be inspired, with the main one being Akame, as she was so inspired that she even asked Tatsumi if he could train her, to which he decided to do so. As with that, we will see Tatsumi and Akame training, with many of them sometimes joining, but at the end of the day, they still had other tasks to do, this being the assassinations, as we now continue on. As during the time when everyone was hunting down for Zank, we will see Tatsumi being the first one to find him, as he immediately began challenging him to a fight, to which Zank begins to comment a bunch of horrible things, pretty much stating that he's going to be very excited to end Tatsumi's life, with Tatsumi telling him that he's not the first one to think that. As with that, we would then see the battle between the two of them, but at the end of the day, it was not really a battle, as Zank would be completely overwhelmed by Tatsumi, as he begins to literally feel just how strong this guy was, as a simple sword slash was enough to send the man flying. As we see Zank beginning to wonder exactly how he's going to deal with Tatsumi, this is when he then gets a good idea, as he begins to use his Imperial Arms to create an illusion, so that way Tatsumi ends up being trapped in it, leaving him vulnerable. As we then see Zank then rush over at Tatsumi as he tries to go for the killing blow, only to be surprised as Tatsumi would then hit him with a powerful pressure, with the pressure being so powerful that it nearly causes him to fall unconscious. As Tatsumi ends up actually being pissed off about this, stating that he still doesn't have enough experience to use it at that capability just yet, this is when he would then turn to Zank before telling him that he's going to take a lot more than that to kill him. As this is when Zank's eyes would then flash before his eyes as his head would then be chopped off, as Tatsumi will be now the victor. Now after this, the rest of Night Raid ends up finding out about this, and they immediately begin to congratulate Tatsumi for his victory. But this actually causes them to ask the question, what exactly is Tatsumi's Imperial Arm? As they wonder if maybe it was one of the katanas or maybe it was all three of them. And Tatsumi, after hearing this, would then raise an eyebrow, as this is when he then calmly announced that he doesn't have an Imperial Arm. Now this will cause shock to be thrown all around Night Raid in the entire base, as every single one of them look at him in complete shock, not being able to believe that a man so powerful had been this entire time without an Imperial Arm. As they try to see if maybe he was joking, only to find out that he wasn't, as he was dead serious. As this is when Tatsumi then calmly reveals that he doesn't want an Imperial Arm unless it's maybe like Akame's katana, as he wouldn't mind having an Imperial Arm like that. Now this will actually cause a comedic reaction from Akame, as she actually ends up holding her Imperial Arm and telling Tatsumi that he can't have it, with everyone laughing at the fact that she was so protective of her imperial arm, although Tatsumi would just scoff, as we now continue on with the story. As for the next couple of weeks that went by, we will see not much really change, as we see Tatsumi continue on with his extreme training methods, with Akame joining in, and not even just Akame but also Bulant and Leone, as after seeing that Akame was doing it, the two of them wanted to participate, as even they were surprised by just how much they were struggling with it. And that was not the only thing, as we see Tatsumi build connections with every member in Night Raid, as the group puts more trust in Tatsumi and more faith in his abilities. As this is where we now turn to a very particular day. Now during this day, we will see both Tatsumi as well as Leone then head out on a mission together, as during this time we would also see Sheele as well as Mine go on a mission as well. Now both groups will go on a mission until we eventually end up turning to Mine and Sheele, as now that they finally accomplished their mission, they were currently right now heading back, so that way they can actually, regroup with the others. But on their way of doing this though, this is when they then encounter Tsuryu, as well as Koro. This being the girl with the guns and her stupid freaking dog. I'm sorry, this character just pisses me off. But either way, she ends up arriving and she immediately begins talking down to the two of them, calling them criminals, as well as letting them know that she knows their identity. As just like that, we will then see both Mine and Sheele then begin to fight against her. And this is when we will then see quickly and surprisingly that both Mine and Sheele get quickly overwhelmed by Tsuryu and her imperial arm, this being Kuro the dog, as the dog was being way too troublesome for the two of them to handle. As eventually after a while we will then see them put in a very bad situation, as Mine actually broke her arm during the time of fighting her, and to making it worse was the fact that Sheele was now vulnerable after trying to protect Mine, as she was completely at the mercy of Kuro. As just as it seemed as if Kuro was finally about to finish off Sheele, as he was actually opening his mouth to bite her, this is when suddenly all they will then see would then be a blur of brown and gray. As the next scene they'll end up seeing is the fact that Kuro completely missed his target, and number two was the fact that Tatsumi had arrived, as he had arrived drawing out one of his swords and holding Sheele in a protective stance, causing the woman to look around in complete confusion as she ends up looking at Tatsumi in surprise. Now when Tatsumi ends up arriving, he tells both Sheele as well as Mine that they were taking their sweet time with this, as truth be told that they were very lucky when it came to how Tatsumi ended up arriving. Because you see, in this timeline, both Tatsumi as well as Leone were able to finish their mission much sooner, as this allowed them a window of opportunity to return back to Night Raid. And after finding out that both Sheele and Mine were taking their time and were away for way too long, this would cause Tatsumi to immediately rush out, as he already began to have a bad feeling about the whole situation, which will lead to the events currently happening. As we now turn our attention back to the scene, we will see Mine breaking down into tears as she collapsed down to the ground, as finally she can finally release a sigh of relief, as she'll be thanking Tatsumi and being extremely grateful to him at the very moment, with Sheele doing the same thing after Tatsumi ends up putting her down. As now that those two were saved, this is when we will then see Tatsumi then approach Tsuryu as well as Kuro, as he will then approach the two with a deadly serious look. Now Tsuryu by this point is losing her mind, as after taking some heavy damage from Mine after losing both her arms, she'll be screaming at Kuro to kill all three of them, including Tatsumi, since now in her eyes Tatsumi was now a criminal scum that deserved to be executed. As we end up seeing Kuro, who's in his berserk state, then rush over at Tatsumi, trying to devour him, with both Mine and Sheele telling him to run or dodge. But this is when something amazing would then happen, as when Kuro ends up reaching out its arm to grab Tatsumi, this is when suddenly multiple quick slashes would then be heard, as Kuro's fingers would then be chopped off, surprising both the Imperial arm and everyone that was watching. As this is when Tatsumi then begins to announce that there's no way that Mine and Sheele lost to something that was so weak. And this will cause Tsuryu to be even more pissed off by the fact that Tatsumi was still breathing, as she would then yell at Kuro to go ahead and kill him already, since she couldn't allow rebel scum like that to continue existing. As you would then see the creature then open up its mouth, this is when suddenly Tatsumi would then end up pulling out a black bandana, as he would then wrap it around his forehead before finally unleashing his two other swords, as he places one in his mouth and grabs the other one in his hand. As this is when both Mine and Sheele would then watch something amazing, as they'll witness for the very first time the legendary 3-sword style. As everyone bears witness as they see Kuro approaching Tatsumi and getting closer and closer, this is when Tatsumi would then announce the name of his attack. 1080-pound Phoenix. He would announce the attack, as this is when suddenly he would then swing his sword so fast that no one was able to see it. As in the first moment they would then see Kuro about to descend upon Tatsumi, and the next moment they would then see the ginormous dog then be completely chopped in half. And to make it even more surprising was that he was not the only one that was hit by the attack, as when they end up looking at Tsuryu, they will end up being surprised as they see that she literally had multiple slash marks across her chest, as she ends up looking on in complete shock, not able to believe that her justice had failed horribly. as her final words will be her calling out Kudo's name, as we end up seeing the ginormous dog then begin to collapse and crumble out of its ginormous berserk form, as it will turn back into its puppy form but slowly begin to fade away, as the last thing we will see from it will be the light draining from its eyes, as Shiryu will end up falling to the ground, now dead. As now with both Shiryu as well as Kudo now defeated, this is when we would then see both Mine, Sheele, as well as Tatsumi then all return back to Night Raid, as they begin to inform them about the events, as we do another time skip. Following these events, we end up seeing a couple of things end up happening. Number one being the fact that Sheele is, well, still alive, as now that Tatsumi had interfered in the event, that means that Sheele did not die like she did in the main timeline. And another thing is the fact that after finding out about what happened, Night Raid was once again very thankful for Tatsumi, and not only that, but they put even more faith in his skills, as Tatsumi was proving once again that he was just simply not like the rest of them, as it will cause him to gain a large amount of respect from Akame, from even the leader of Night Raid, and basically everyone that was part of the group. One change that actually happened that was very particular is the fact that Mine's personality had dimmed down by quite a lot, as she actually treated Tatsumi with respect and with affection, as she 100% was confident that if Tatsumi did not arrive there, Sheele would have been more than likely dead, as by that point she was already useless, her arm was still broken, and if Tatsumi didn't arrive, then they just simply would have been screwed. There would be no way out of it. And speaking of Sheele, we actually see her actually undergo a change, as after all the events that played out during that time, she realized just how close she was to death, and she realized that she needs to get way stronger. So with that thought process, she would actually go to the very person that she knows can definitely help her, this being none other than Tatsumi as well as Akame, since those two by far were the strongest ones. And Tatsumi had like no real problem when it came to training Sheele, as after all, that benefited him as well, as after all, if they're stronger, that means he gets stronger opponents. And just that thought process made him even more excited, and the main reason for this is because of the fact that Tatsumi does realize that even though he is pretty strong, he's nowhere near the level that he once was in his old life. I mean, heck, that Conqueror Spirit that he released against Zinc, the Executor, that wasn't even enough to knock him out. So already he can see that he still has a long way to go, but he was more than willing to train for it. And if Night Raid becomes stronger while doing so, then shoot, that was just another benefit waiting to happen. So with that, we end up seeing Sheele join in on the training, and not just Sheele but also Mine as well, after her arm recovers of course. As after this, we can now end up cutting to the very present as we now see another event end up playing out. This being the fact that both Bulant and Tatsumi were sent out on a mission, but during the time of doing this mission, both of them would then be ambushed by none other than Bulant's old leader, as he ends up arriving along with a little bit of backup, as he states that his intentions here are just to kill Bulant, but also to kill Tatsumi as well since he's working with Bulant. As after stating his intentions, this is when we will then see Tatsumi then unleash all three of his swords, as this is when he then tells Bulant to take care of his old friend while he takes care of the backup, as he ends up vanishing right before their very eyes, taking the backup with him as he decides to face off against him, as this will cause both Bulant as well as his old leader to have a 1v1, with the leader actually having a little bit of an advantage, mostly because of the fact that his Imperial Arms gives him control over liquid, or liquid that was around him. So thanks to that, this ends up leading to a very tough fight, with both sides giving it all they got. On the other side though, we see Tatsumi as this man is just completely making a complete joke out of the backup that the old leader had brought, as the man was getting completely overwhelmed and getting multiple slash marks when Tatsumi was only using only 2 swords. He didn't even need to use the third one. As Tatsumi begins to feel very disappointed about it, this is when he then catches notice of something very interesting, as this is when the man, after finally having enough of Tatsumi just simply making fun of him and treating him as a joke, he then ends up pulling out a vial as he ends up literally stabbing it into his arm, as this is when he begins to inject himself with a strength enhancing serum, something that the entire empire was using in order to make sure that their soldiers are way more powerful. As Tatsumi wound up looking on an interest as the man begins to grow more and more powerful, as he was actually pretty impressed by just how much boost he was getting, but at the same time he was feeling kind of a little bit of disappointment, mostly because of the fact of he expected much more of a boost. I mean, he's seen much more powerful boosts in his old life and even in this one, as he's seen way more powerful people. But Tatsumi does take note of this entire situation, as he remembers to share this with the group later on, as it seems as if the entire empire seems to have something that was boosting their strength. Not by a lot, but by enough to the point where even members of Night Raid might have trouble with it. Which good thing Tatsumi was not like the others, as by the time the man finally powered up as he would then rush at Tatsumi, all Tatsumi did was just simply smirk before suddenly vanishing, as this is when suddenly he would then end up interacting with the man before finally finishing him off, as all it took was 3 slashes, 1 for the arms and 1 for the head. As the man's body would fall to the ground, now completely finished off, we now end up turning our attention to Bulant, and to everyone's surprise, in this timeline he actually ends up winning. As just like in the old timeline, he ends up winning this fight, with the only difference being the fact that since Tatsumi was actually able to win his fight in this timeline, that means that the old leader did not survive the last blow from Bulant. As the only reason why Bulant lost that fight was because of the fact that the other guy intervened in it and took the blow for the leader. So thanks to that, Bulant ends up winning the fight, as him and Tatsumi end up going back to Night Raid and reporting about this, with Tatsumi sharing the knowledge about the serum that seems to be giving their soldiers a boost of strength. Now this does end up making the leader of Night Raid worried, until eventually she then finally finds out a plan for it. And the plan was very simple. She ends up telling Tatsumi to train the rest of the members, which was quite surprising for the only ones that weren't training just yet, but eventually they all agreed to it. As whatever Tatsumi was doing, it seems to be effective, as literally Tatsumi faced off against someone who had the strength enhancement and was still able to beat them quite effortlessly. So with that, Tatsumi decides to train the rest of them, as every last one of them would then participate in his training, with Lubbock being the only one to really complain about the whole thing. But still regardless, this does end up giving Night Raid a much needed power boost that they will need for later on. As now with this, we can now continue on with the story. Doing a little bit of a brief time skip, we now see Leone, Tatsumi, as well as Lubbock, as all of them were now currently inside the capital, trying to gather information as well as some supplies so that way they can make dinner for later. Now during the time of doing this though, they will then encounter a ginormous tournament that was currently being held, as apparently the winner of it ends up getting an Imperial arm all to themselves. Now this will end up piquing the interest of all 3 of them, as this is when Tatsumi will then sign up, just like he does in the main timeline. But during the time of doing this though, as we see Tatsumi's first match end up coming up, this is when something very shocking will then happen. Changing our attention, we will then see it, the cold Empress Esdeath, as she'll be currently sitting down on her throne, viewing every last one of them, as this was also a way for her to actually find her love interest. But during the time of actually viewing this entire tournament that was going down, this is when she finally found him, as she finally recognized who that man was. As she saw a very particular boy or man just suddenly enter the arena, and the one thing that really catched her attention were the 3 swords that she found just chilling at his waist. As this when suddenly Esdeath would then stand up, catching the attention of her acquaintances as they begin to ask her what was wrong, but this is when suddenly they would then see something surprising. As Esdeath, the cold emperor, actually had a blush on her face, and she had heart in her eyes, she would then actually end up grabbing her cheek with one of her hands. As finally, after so long, she finally found him again, and this time she won't let him escape. As just as her acquaintance would then begin to ask her multiple different questions, Esdeath will then suddenly end up blitz into the arena, as everyone in the arena, all they end up seeing is literally a blue blur, with Tatsumi being the only one that can really see her movements. As this is when we would then see the blue blur then slam into the center of the arena, as a ginormous amount of smoke would then fill in the entire area, as everyone begins to look around in confusion before finally the smoke would then settle in. As this is when both Leone as well as Lubbock take a good look at the scene and immediately pale after seeing that Tatsumi was now currently in front of the most powerful person in the entire empire. As they end up looking at the scene in shock, and what's even more surprising is that Tatsumi, for the very first time that they knew of the guy, was actually paling as he looks at the woman. As Tatsumi was paling so much that his face was literally turning blue. As Tatsumi right now was just asking himself the same question. Why? Why out of all the times he had to encounter this lady right here, right now? As Tatsumi continues looking on as if he sees a ghost, this is when we would then see Esdeath, as currently right now by this point she was currently on top of Tatsumi's opponent, which during the time of her landing here she actually killed him just upon impact, but she didn't even care at all, not in the slightest. And as in fact she just casually ends up stepping over the corpse, moving out the way so that way she can appear right in front of Tatsumi. As the entire area gets tense as Tatsumi tries to back away from her, but unfortunately it was too late, as suddenly Esdeath would then lunge at him. As both Lubbock and Leone begin to look down in sadness as they actually think that this might be it for Tatsumi, this is when something shocking would then happen, as in a display of affection they would then see Esdeath then grab a hold of Tatsumi and put him into a nice long hug. And not only that, but she will begin to scream at the top of her lungs, "Darling," which ends up catching everyone off guard, since this was Esdeath, the cold emperor, someone who was so stoic and only valued battle, and here she was actually being affectionate and being all cuddly with Tatsumi. Which, speaking of Tatsumi, by this point his entire face was blue, and not only that, but he was foaming at the mouth while being in the grip of Esdeath. As right now all he can think in his mind is just why out of all the times he had to meet up with this crazy lady once again, right here, right now. As this is where we now do a little bit of a flashback. Turning back all the way to the point where Tatsumi was still a bounty hunter, we see him right now taking down his latest capture. As by this point, the man begins to scream for his life, but unfortunately Tatsumi was not going to show mercy to him, especially after finding out what he did. As after finishing the man off, we will then see Tatsumi then continue on with his journey, now feeling a little bit disappointed by the fact that he didn't get a good fight. But during the time of his journey though, this is when suddenly he ends up stopping at a nearby village that was completely in ruin, as literally it looked like an entire war zone had happened out here. As Tatsumi would just casually end up walking through it, casually avoiding all the rubble that was falling apart around the entire village. But during that time of him visiting there, he would then soon encounter Esdeath. As when she looks at Tatsumi, she looks at him with a cold gaze before asking him if he's her enemy, with Tatsumi telling her that that's solely dependent on her next few choices after this moment. And Esdeath, after hearing this, made the only choice that she can think of, this being to attack Tatsumi with the intention to kill, with Tatsumi responding and actually being surprised when he struggled against her. As with that, the two of them would then carry on to battle, as we see the battle between the two actually lasting for an entire week, as during the time we will see Esdeath begin to get slowly more and more deranged, or at least in Tatsumi's eyes, as during the time of him fighting against her, you'll see her slowly begin to actually pick up on some very weird quirks. Number one being the fact that she began blushing, she began stating some darling or whatever stuff, she began to literally have heart in her eyes, and overall she began to act like a complete whack job, or at least in Tatsumi's own eyes. But this will actually be due to the fact that just like in the main timeline, Esdeath fell for Tatsumi, as after seeing how strong he was and seeing that he was actually very strong and not only that but in her own eyes very attractive, this actually ended up leading to her falling for him. As by the end of that week, we will then see the two of them then go their separate ways after the fight ended in a draw, as Tatsumi during that point was unfortunately not strong enough to beat Esdeath, with Esdeath in the same situation as well, as the fight will end with both of them knocking each other out, with both of them actually landing a permanent scar on each other. As after that, Tatsumi will be the first one to wake up, as after that he will end up leaving the area, leaving Esdeath behind, as when she wakes up, she immediately declares that she will hunt him down and make him fall in love with her. As this is where we now cut back to the present. As turning to the present, we will see similar events play out just like they do in the main timeline, as Tatsumi will be brought into the capital, as he will be shown around the entire palace and everything, get introduced to all of Esdeath's generals as well as her allies, and soon afterwards, nightfall will end up arriving as Tatsumi will end up being taken to Esdeath's room, as he will be staying there for the night. Now when Tatsumi is there, Esdeath will end up walking in, as she firmly begins to declare all her different fantasies about what exactly they're going to do with each other, with Tatsumi just firmly declaring that that was not going to happen anytime soon. As Tatsumi, it wasn't the fact that he was oblivious to her liking for him, it's just that the way she went about it was way too extreme, as she was doing it way too pushy and way too forceful, as Tatsumi already knew that a relationship should only be formed when both individuals have mutual feelings for the other. But unfortunately, Esdeath didn't seem to understand that, as after Tatsumi explained this to her, she just simply looked at him and laughed before telling him that she's gonna win him over, regardless of what he says. As after that, we will then see the two of them then fall into a silence, as this is when suddenly Esdeath will then walk over to their bed and also drag Tatsumi in there as well, since she ends up explaining that he's gonna be sleeping there regardless of what he says, as we just see the two of them just laying down there, doing nothing else, just laying down there. But during the time of just laying down there, this is when Tatsumi would then open his mouth just as Esdeath was just finishing up her rant about what exactly they're going to be doing to each other in the future, as this is when Tatsumi then drops the bomb by telling her that he joined Night Raid. Now in an instant after hearing these words, this is when suddenly Esdeath, moving so fast that most people wouldn't be able to see her, she ends up grabbing her blade before putting it at Tatsumi's neck, before asking him in the most serious tone possible while looking him directly in the eyes that if what he says is true, what's stopping her from killing him right here, right now? And for the first time since Tatsumi has been with Esdeath, we will then see him smirk, as this is when suddenly Esdeath will then be hit by a powerful pressure, as this will cause her to become unbalanced, as she loses the grip on her sword, but also causes her to unintentionally fall on top of Tatsumi, as this will cause her to blush and immediately begin to act all flustered. As this is when, in the most shocking turn of events, Tatsumi in the most bold way possible will then wrap an arm around Esdeath's waist, as he would then put one of his arms behind his head as he begins to lay down on the bed. And when he does so, he begins to slowly drift off to sleep, before explaining one last thing to Esdeath, telling her that if she's not able to withstand that she can't even possibly think about killing someone like him. And this will cause Esdeath to actually blush, as we would then see her literal pupils turn into hearts, as this is when suddenly, right as Tatsumi was about to go to bed, she would then kiss him, just like she does in the main timeline, as she would then drift off to sleep with a smile on her face, with Tatsumi sighing as he then tells her that she's one annoying woman before going to sleep as well. As with that, we would then do a time skip to the next day. And I'm not going to explain much of the next day, as really the next day, all of it involves really is just Tatsumi escaping from Esdeath, as he's able to escape out of there much easier thanks to his skills. And when Esdeath catches wind about this, instead of being upset or being mad at Tatsumi, this only made her feel even more affectionate towards him, as she felt even further for Tatsumi as her affection for him skyrocketed because of this. As now that we're done with this segment, I can now continue on with the story. But before we move on though, I do want to let you guys know on something very important here. In this timeline, Tatsumi is actually at the age of 18. As I just wanted to let you guys know so that way no issues could arise later on, as I don't know why they didn't do this in the main timeline, but just to be safe for both my mentality as well for yours, in this timeline Tatsumi is going to be 18, okay? Okay, so now with that, let's go ahead and continue back on with the story. Now moving on with the story, we will see Tatsumi as he ends up arriving back to the base, and when he does, immediately all the members begin to check him and ask him multiple different questions, to which he answers them to the best of his abilities. And soon afterwards, he actually ends up revealing the fact that he revealed to Esdeath that he actually was a part of Night Raid, which causes all of them to look at him as if he was stupid. Why would you reveal that? But this is when Tatsumi would then argue back, stating that she was going to find out regardless, as all they were doing was just preventing the inevitable. As soon after going back and forth for quite a while, we would then see them settle it, as this is when the leader of Night Raid would then soon end up introducing the new members, as we end up seeing Susanoo as well as Chelsea. As both of them will end up introducing themselves in their own ways, soon afterwards we will see that Night Raid has actually been boosted up when it comes to power, especially since both Bulan and Sheele are still alive in this timeline. And now with the added addition of both Chelsea as well as Susanoo in here, this brought Night Raid to a total of 10 members now, which was a good thing since now that they have new members as well as the fact that in this timeline they're actually stronger than their canon counterparts. This would give them a much better opportunity when it came to actually fighting back against the Empire, as they would actually send their forces at Night Raid when they eventually find their base. And in this timeline, every last one of them end up getting out of there alive, including Lubbock, who was supposed to die during this event. But unfortunately for Night Raid, things only get even worse, as moving on after escaping and trying to find a new base, they will then soon encounter the Jaegers, an elite group of Imperial arms users that was led by none other than Esdeath, as every member of Night Raid has to go their separate ways to actually face off against their own opponents, with of course Tatsumi being the only one to really go after them by himself, while the rest of them go in groups besides Akame. As we see Tatsumi facing off against the members of Jaguar, as he will be there having a field day, especially since in this timeline, since now Suryu is dead, bringing the Jaguars to even less members, this will cause the ones that were actually a part of the group to actually train to grow even stronger, in order to pick up the slack of having one less member. So this actually gave Tatsumi a much better fight than he expected, as he was actually taking some pretty big damage to the point where he was even bleeding. But even besides all that, we would see Tatsumi charging in there with a generous smile on his face, as he continues just simply rampaging about, as literally every single swing would cause a ginormous tornado to form, as multiple amount of trees that were in the area would be completely chopped off and literally blown away. As by the time Tatsumi was finally done with the fight, he would be there standing tall and proud even though he took in some heavy damage, as after that he would then rush over to the others to see if they need any help. And speaking of the others, they actually don't need any help, since now in this timeline Night Raid has much more people in their group, since both Bulan and Sheele are still alive, and not only that, but also because of the fact that they're stronger, they're actually able to deal with the forces much easier. And during this time though, as Tatsumi was doing this though, he would then end up encountering Chelsea, as in this timeline she was still trying to do the same tactic that she did in the main one, as she was trying to pretty much kill off the only two real threats when it came to the Jaguars, this being Akame's sister and also Bullis, this being the guy with the mask who has a family and everything. Yeah. Now when Tatsumi ends up overhearing her plan, he looks at her for a very solid minute before calling her stupid. Now this will cause her to be pissed off, as this is when she begins to actually go on a rant telling Tatsumi that someone like him wouldn't survive long, as even though he has a bunch of power, he makes a horrible assassin. And Tatsumi after hearing this will then say nothing more, as he then turns his back away from her, as this is when she will then begin to proceed with her plan, as this is when we will then see similar events play out just like they do in the main timeline. As during this time we will see Chelsea try to assassinate Bullis as well as Kuromi, which is Akame's sister, but this ends up failing horribly, as while she was successful when it came to Bullis, Unfortunately, she failed when it came to facing off against Kurumi, as thanks to Kurumi using the strength enhancing serum, she was actually able to get back on her feet and survive the killing blow that Chelsea had used against her. As after that, Chelsea tries to escape, but this is when suddenly her fingers will then be chopped off, surprising her as she then lashes out in pain. As this is when suddenly we will then see Kurumi then use her Imperial Arms, as she uses it to bring forth the rest of the dead to hunt her down. As just as it seems as if it was finally up for Chelsea, this is when suddenly as a ginormous spear would then be tossed directly at her arm, we will then hear the sound of a blade intercepting it. As Chelsea ends up looking around in confusion while still holding her bleeding hand, this is when she would then look behind her to see none other than Tatsumi. As even though he was bloody, even though he had taken quite a bit of injuries after the earlier fight, he still was looking on with a smirk on his face before telling Chelsea that she was stupid. As she ends up looking at him in pure amazement, this is when we would then see Tatsumi then face off against Kurumi, this being Akame's sister. As both of them would then stare down at each other as the dead would stare down at Tatsumi, this is when we would then see Tatsumi then begin to barrage the dead as he would then slash right through them. And to Kurumi's surprise, he wouldn't just simply stop after slicing them. No, he will continue swinging his swords rapidly enough to the point where literally he will shred them up to pieces, leaving nothing left behind. Nothing that she could revive at least. As he literally just completely ends up erasing them with every single slash, as later a ginormous wind will begin to pick up. As the ginormous wind will actually cloud Kurumi's vision as she was being pushed away, this is when suddenly by the time it finally stopped and she looks up at the scene, she will then see that both Chelsea as well as Tatsumi had fled the area, as she realized that they had successfully gone away. As she ends up collapsing to the ground, now feeling the effects of the serum now hitting her, as she begins cursing under her breath for letting them escape. And speaking of them escaping, we will then see both Chelsea as well as Tatsumi as they finally were able to escape the area, as Tatsumi was just simply walking with a relaxed expression, acting as if he literally wasn't bleeding from the forehead from the earlier fights that he had. In Chelsea, she would just be looking at him in a complex expression as she was looking down at the ground before looking back at him before looking back at the ground again. Before eventually, this is when Tatsumi then stops as he tells her to speak up, as he already knows that she has something to say. And this is when, in the most shocking event possible, she would then apologize to Tatsumi as she actually felt bad about what she said earlier, and she felt even more bad especially since Tatsumi was the one to save her life. As he hadn't been there, then boy, you guys already know how that scene played out. I still get a little bit traumatized just thinking of it. But still, regardless of that, Tatsumi just nods his head before walking off. But by this point though, Tatsumi did realize one important thing. He still wasn't at the strength that he wanted to be at. As if Tatsumi was at the strength that he wanted to be at, not only could he have ripped those entire undeads to shreds immediately with only one slash, but he would have been able to take down Kurumi as well. But thanks to his injuries right now, and also because of his current strength, he couldn't do so. As with those thoughts plaguing Tatsumi's mind, this is when he then vows to make sure that he gets back at that strength level, as he decides to double down on his training. No, triple down on his training. Basically, he was going to be training even harder than he usually does. To which every member that actually took part of Tatsumi's training and actually was there to experience it, they will all shudder as they felt as if a bad omen had fell upon them. Which was odd for them, especially since during this time this was one of their happiest days, since not only were they able to weaken the Empire's forces, but they were able to survive, all of them. As we end up turning to see both Chelsea as well as Tatsumi end up arriving, as immediately after seeing their conditions, all members of Night Raid would actually begin to assist when it comes to treating their injuries. As after patching them up as well as scolding them a little bit for doing what they did, eventually the group begins to settle in as finally things were looking up for them, as in this timeline all of them were able to survive. As so far, Night Raid has not suffered even one death, as this will actually cause the very leader of Night Raid to actually be extremely grateful for Tatsumi, as she knew that Tatsumi was the main reason why things were going so smoothly for them. As right after this, we will then see Night Raid immediately begin to look for a new base, to which luckily it was already getting quickly established from the others that were currently working for them. As after doing this for quite a while and soon finding their new base, we will then see a couple events play out. Nothing much, as we see them take on many different tasks, and not only that, but they also continue on with their training. Chelsea is unfortunately going to have to be benched for quite a while, since she did got quite a bit of damage when it came to her fingers. So due to that, she won't be, field ready for quite a while. But still, regardless of that, the other members there, including Susanoo, every last one of them will then be put through Tatsumi's horrible training. And to make it even more shocking to them, Tatsumi's training will be even worse on himself, as he literally did not even double it or triple it. No, he quadrupled it. The madman was doing the very same thing that he has always been, but he did it 4 times more extreme. As while the rest of them are struggling with just the regular training, Tatsumi will be bringing it to higher levels, as they wonder how the heck the man was even still alive. How did he not pull anything? How did he not suffer any cramps or injuries? As the only thing to explain all this, at least in their minds, is the fact that Tatsumi was just simply not human. There was no way to explain it, that's just it. That he was just simply not human. As after doing this for quite a while, as well as taking missions, this is when they would then announce for their final plan. This being the fact that now that they all gotten stronger, it was finally time for them to finally follow through with their plan. This being that they're now planning to actually storm the Empire and bring it down. As after this, they will then have a couple of days of preparation. As we see all the members of Night Raid actually doubling down on their workout routine, while at the same time preparing their weapons, as it was definitely going to be a battle that was going to go down in history. But during the time of doing this though, this is when we would then see Tatsumi, as during the time of him doing a mission with Lubbock, he actually ends up getting stranded on an island. But during the time of him being on an island, this is when he would then encounter Esdeath. Now when Esdeath sees Tatsumi, she immediately begins to act completely different. As one moment she's very stoic and cold, the next minute she becomes all blushing and giggling as soon as she sees Tatsumi, as she immediately begins to hug him and begins to get all cuddly with him, as Tatsumi just be there staring at her awkwardly. As soon after Esdeath ends up settling down, this is when the two of them would then begin to catch up, as Tatsumi was being quite casual about everything while also eating some fruit that he found on the island, with of course Esdeath just being there blushing and everything. But soon after hearing everything that was happening with Night Raid, she just stares at Tatsumi with a serious expression, which was hard to say it was serious since she still had the, blush on her face, but still regardless, she was trying to remain serious here. Since pretty much all she's hearing right now is the fact that Tatsumi is carrying Night Raid right now. As after he catched her up on everything, she truly felt and believed that literally the main reason why all of them were still alive was literally because of him. And she would even point this out with Tatsumi disagreeing about that, even though he doesn't know just how true that is. As soon after that, the two of them would then fall into silence, as this is when Tatsumi would then reveal their plans to storm the Empire. As when Esdeath hears this, she actually ends up tensing for a little bit before explaining to Tatsumi that if they go through with this, then that means that the two of them will have to kill each other, with Tatsumi nodding his head in a very serious expression. And for the first time ever since Esdeath has been with Tatsumi, she actually stops blushing and actually has a serious expression, as she tells Tatsumi to not go with the plan and actually join her, as she just simply cannot even think about facing off against him with the intention to kill. But just as she expected, Tatsumi responded with a firm nope, as he was not going to join the Empire. As when Esdeath heard this, she just simply nodded her head, accepting it, as she finally realized that this was just who Tatsumi was, and if she was being honest, she wouldn't change that about him. But unfortunately, right now was not the time to think about him fondly, as this is when we would then see Esdeath then step up, as she would then get into a battle stance, as Tatsumi would then look at her with a raised eyebrow but also with a serious look. As this is when Esdeath then states that she can't bring herself to kill him, but what she can do though is that she can literally knock him out and keep them captive throughout the entire time until eventually the entire war is over. As after that, she would then return back alive obviously, and after that the two of them can just simply spend their lives together. Now when Tatsumi hears this, he immediately scoffs at her plans, already by this point understanding exactly how she goes about things, as this when suddenly he gets his own idea. As we see Tatsumi responding to Esdeath by entering into his own battle stance, with him already bringing out his 3 swords and preparing for battle, this is when he then asks Esdeath if maybe they can make this into a bet. And when Esdeath hears this, she actually looks on with interest, as this is when Tatsumi would then reveal the bet. If he is actually able to beat Esdeath in this fight, then she actually has to join Night Raid. But if he ends up losing this fight, well, he's not going to join the Empire, and he's more than certainly not going to betray Night Raid, but what he will do was that he actually will end up exiting out the war. Pretty much while the entire war is going on, he'll be out of it. Now when Esdeath hears this, she actually thinks about it for a while before smirking as she will then agree to the terms. As with that, this is when we will then see a battle between Esdeath and Tatsumi. As we see a silence then fall upon the battlefield, this is when we would then see the two of them then suddenly disappear into a blur, as they would then clash in the middle, causing a generous shockwave to shake out the entire island that they were on. As both of them would then collide, they would then begin to exchange battles between swords, as literally Tatsumi begins to actually have Esdeath on the backhand, as she was surprised by his overwhelming power, but this only made her even more affectionate towards him, as she begins to announce that he was incredible before suddenly stabbing Tatsumi in the side, which causes him to literally just smirk at the response before he would then cut her on the cheek. As both of them begin to go blow for blow, with each one of them actually receiving damage from the other, as by the time they finally end up separating, both of them will have several cuts across their body. As this one we would then see Tatsumi then charge up his attack, as this one he would then shout Onigiri. As this one, in a move that was so fast for Esdeath that she couldn't even react, she would then end up getting a slash right across her chest. As this one Tatsumi would then turn back to Esdeath before asking her if that was all she got, with Esdeath, even though she was bleeding, actually smirking as she ends up using her imperial arms to create a generous amount of ice around her chest, causing the wound to be sealed up shut. As after that, she would then rush at Tatsumi as she begins to send out many piercing blows at him, to which he's able to deflect it until suddenly, to his surprise, he actually ends up getting stabbed twice in the stomach by 2 ice shards. He ends up looking down in complete shock before suddenly he ends up getting a slash mark across his right eye, as Esdeath began to incorporate ice manipulation into her fighting style. As Tatsumi would look on in amazement, this is when he would then see Esdeath charging up another attack, as he would then respond with a 180-pound phoenix, as their collision would send the other one flying, as we see both Tatsumi and Esdeath separate. As we end up seeing Tatsumi as he will be currently on the ground before getting up, as by this point he ends up looking down at his injuries to see that they were not pretty, as by this point he was able to take out the ice spikes that are currently in his stomach, as he sees himself bleeding by quite a lot, and realizing that he needs to end this fight soon. Although Esdeath, she was not doing any better, as thanks to that last interaction with the 180-pound phoenix, she actually ended up getting a cut mark on her left eye that was right across her left eye, and not only that, but she also got a slash mark across her shoulder and a little bit on her forehead as well, as basically both of them were heavily injured. As she ends up getting up, she ends up apologizing to Tatsumi for injuring his face, with Tatsumi shrugging it off, telling her the same thing. As with that, this is when the both of them would actually send each other a genuine smile. Not for the fact of their weird affection or really anything like that, but just simply for the fact that they're truly enjoying this fight. As this is when Esdeath would then charge up, but she then tells Tatsumi that this will be the last deciding blow, with Tatsumi agreeing with it. As just like that, the both of them would then prepare to unleash their ultimate attacks, as just as Tatsumi was about to announce his attack, this is when suddenly Esdeath would then freeze time. As just like that, we would then see Tatsumi now stuck in the stance, as Esdeath with a sigh would then approach him. She looks at Tatsumi with a warm smile, telling him that she is very excited for their future together. As after that, she would then do an extremely powerful slash across Tatsumi's chest. As after that, we will then see Esdeath unfreeze time, as Tatsumi ends up being surprised by the injury, as he ends up collapsing down onto one knee, as it seems as if Esdeath had won the battle. But just as Esdeath was about to, take her prize, this is when, to her surprise, Tatsumi is still standing. Even with all the injuries, he was still standing. As this is when Tatsumi would then begin to announce his attack, and Esdeath unfortunately at the moment couldn't do anything, as she looks at him in pure amazement before shouting at the top of her lungs that he was the perfect man for her. As this is when Tatsumi would then announce his attack, Onigiri, Ashura. As after saying these words, we will then see Tatsumi then blitz Esdeath, as she would then close her eyes with a satisfying smile. As after that, she would then be bombarded by multiple slashes all across her body, as by the time the attack had finally finished, we would then see Esdeath as she collapses down to the ground, falling into unconscious thanks to her losing too much blood at the moment. As with that, we see Tatsumi standing over her, as just like that, Tatsumi had came out the victor in the fight between him and Esdeath. As we now do another time skip. Following those events, we end up seeing Tatsumi as, after quite a while on the island, the two of them are eventually able to escape. And when they do, Tatsumi ends up eventually returning back to Night Raid along with Esdeath. Now when they see her, they immediately try to fight her, but luckily after talking things over with Tatsumi as well as Esdeath, they're soon able to settle down. As soon after catching them all up on the information, eventually they now realize that they now have the Empire's strongest member working with them, as they just simply could not believe the concept. But still, regardless of that, they just simply can just throw it out there, just thinking that that was just the way Tatsumi did things. He did the impossible. As after that, after treating their injuries, we end up seeing the Empire then slowly end up crumbling, as now with Esdeath along with Night Raid, it was an easy sweep. No one was able to stop them. As with that, we would then see the end of the Empire, as now a new one was going to be built up. One that was going to be way better than the old corrupted society. As we now turn to the very final moments of this What If. we end up seeing the new empire currently being built up, as many people all around that was actually assisting when it came to taking down the empire were assisting when it comes to building up the new one. As already, they were making many plans for exactly what they're planning to do here, as we see all the members of Night Raid chipping in, as they will actually be deemed as heroes. As we now turn to the very final moments, we see Night Raid, as by this point it's currently nighttime, and all around there will be an entire festival being thrown at this time, celebrating the end of the empire. As everyone will be cheering, drinking, and eating, we will see Tatsumi as he would actually be there just relaxing, as he'll be sipping on some booze with a happy smile on his face. Esdeath would of course be right beside him, as she would just be there blushing while also giving him some booze, as he would just casually just sip it while also looking at her with a less annoyed look now, as he finally got to know her a little bit better now. And not only that, but her personality seems to develop a little bit more than it used to be. As these will be the final moments of this what if, as we see Tatsumi take one last sip of his beer before smirking, as after all there was still much more he needed to do in order to become the strongest swordsman in the world. As this will be the end to what if Tatsumi was Zoro's reincarnation. Thank y'all so much for tuning into this what if. Hopefully you guys do enjoy yourselves. I'm sorry y'all, like I'm really tired right now. I don't really got much else to say. Number one being the fact that we just reached 10k subscribers, y'all. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'll be screaming much more. It's just the fact that, guys, it is 4:16 in the morning. Your boy is tired. I'm probably gonna make the what if the 10k special soon, now that I'm done making this what if, and you guys can expect that. But right now your boy is tired and it's time for him to get some rest. But still, regardless of that, y'all, I do want to thank y'all for tuning into this what if, and I really did hope that you guys enjoyed yourself. And I do want to say thank you very much to y'all for getting me up to 10k subscribers. It really means a lot to me. But yeah, guys, that's enough for now. It's your host, Sage D Samurai here, and he's signing off. So peace and have a lovely day.
Colors, this is the color, this is the color, this is the color.